What if I told you the conventional wisdom of minimizing labor cost at all costs is destroying your profitability? We'll dive into today how lean staffing is kind of fundamentally flawed. You'll also discover how strategic overstaffing and above market compensation can dramatically increase your bottom line through higher revenue per customer, reduced turnover, and better operational control. And learn why the most profitable bars in the industry are spending more on labor, not less, and how this counterintuitive approach could double your profits. Hello, and welcome to the Bar Business Podcast, where we help bar owners increase profits, attract loyal guests, and simplify operations so you can avoid burnout and finally enjoy your life outside of your bar. I'm your host, Chris Schneider, the Bar Business Coach. Before we get started, a quick thank you to our sponsors, Spot On, who provided. So today we're challenging conventional wisdom about labor costs, and we're exposing why constantly cutting staff hours might be killing your profits. And we're going to talk about a little bit more of a sophisticated approach that you can take that can help improve your bottom line. Now, if you've been in the bar business for any length of time, you've probably heard that you need to keep your labor costs below 30% of revenue, and that your first response to a slow night should be to cut staff. And I will admit, I have said that a lot myself on this podcast. And that's generally true. But it also fails to admit some realities that exist. And if you've been listening to the last couple of weeks of this podcast, you've realized one thing that we've hit on a few times in the last month or so is kind of advanced strategies. So to going from the basic of where we started and the basics of the business into slightly more nuanced approaches. And so today we're really going to get into the more nuanced approach to your labor. Now, as we go through this, mind you, I'm not just saying you pay more in labor and you make more money. I am absolutely not saying that. Fundamentally, if your labor cost is too high, you don't make money. That is a fact. But when we take a more nuanced approach, when we see staff as an investment rather than a cost, when we value our people, you can increase profitability while creating a better experience for your team and therefore a better experience for your guests. And that's something to keep in mind as we go through this whole episode today. And I know that I've talked about it before, and I will talk about it many, many times in the future. Your team experience becomes your guest experience. How well you treat your team is how well they treat your guests. Culture rolls downhill. You are the top of that hill. Your guests are the bottom of that hill. So your team is the hill. They're what's in the middle. So how you treat your team is how they treat your guests. And that's part of what's critically important to understand here. So let's go through the traditional approach to labor cost and where it can hurt you a little bit. So the conventional wisdom says cut labor at every opportunity. And yeah, if your labor is too high, you should cut it. Yeah, if you overscheduled or you were anticipating higher sales than what you have, you should cut your labor, right? There's nothing worse from an employee side to be standing around doing nothing and not getting tips and making money. But the flip side of that coin is when your employees are actually understaffed, they're not going to be as effective. They're not going to provide as good of service. They are going to hurt your guest experience. That's because you're asking too much out of one person and you needed, in all honesty, to have more people on the floor. Also, when you're understaffed consistently, something that's going to happen is that's going to increase your turnover. Right? People like to work in great environments. They don't like to work in bad environments where they're abused and overworked. If your staffing is too tight, you're going to ruin your guest experience and increase your turnover. Now, industry data, if we look at it, shows that the cost of replacing a bartender is at least $5,000. That's the low end estimate I've seen. On the high end, you're looking at $10,000, $20,000 in some cases. And it really depends on how well your bartenders are trained, but if you're the neighborhood bar and you're just pouring Jack and Cokes and draft beer, replacing a bartender is not going to cost you too much. It's still going to cost you $5,000 or $6,000, but it's not going to cost you a huge amount. If you are a high-end cocktail bar and you have a lot of complicated cocktails and a lot of training and a lot of very important pieces that everyone has to be aware of when you bring them on, training that person and losing the productivity of the guy that left is going to cost you a lot more money. Now, the biggest problem here is turnover. Because one thing we think about a lot, we say, well, we don't want turnover. Turnover is bad. But why is turnover bad? It's bad because it creates an inconsistent guest experience. And that means you're damaging your repeat business. And the repeat business is the lifeblood of your bar. If you don't have, and I've thrown this out there before, 80% of your business should be repeat business, 20% should be new business. That's what you need to constantly replenish your regulars once you're up and operating and everything is going great. So you need that lifeblood. You need those regulars. Otherwise, you will fail. And when you have high turnover, you have an inconsistent experience. An inconsistent experience is going to not attract regulars. At the same time, something we should be aware of is, like I said before, when we're understaffed, that's going to hurt our guest experience. Our guests are going to leave sooner. They're going to order less. They're going to have worse experience. Again, that's not reinforcing and turning them into regulars. Now, when we also have high turnover, another thing that we have to worry about is management time. So as everyone, I think, realizes that listens to this podcast, hiring people, doing interviews, accepting applications, calling people back, that is a slow, annoying, painstaking process. And so when our managers are constantly focused on hiring, which I've always said, some part of your time every day as an owner or a manager should be spent on hiring. But when an undue amount of your time is spent on hiring, when you have constant turnover and people you have to replace, that means that your management and you as the owner are potentially focused on hiring and training more than you're focused on revenue generation, marketing, strategic planning, long-term growth, those things that are actually going to drive your business forward. Now, one thing to think about here is when we talk labor, and I do this as much as anyone else, we talk about labor cost percentage, right? Total labor cost divided by my revenue. And yeah, 30% is about the cap on where you want that number. But when we only look at that number, now, mind you, I'm not saying that number is not important. I'm not saying you don't have to focus on it. But when you only focus on that percentage does not take into account labor quality and labor quantity. You're just looking at a percentage. You don't know how great the people are working. You don't know how many people you have working. And that quality and that quantity are really what impacts your revenue, not some cost percentage off your P&L. And I say that, if you've listened to this for any length of time, you know I love P&Ls. I love data analytics. That is my game. But I'm telling you right now, just focusing on that cost percentage metric is not going to give you a complete picture of what you need to when it comes to your labor. At least you should also be measuring turnover. Now, here's an example to kind of solidify everything we've talked about. So if you're just focused on that labor percentage and your labor percentage is 32%, and say you're the owner and you go to your manager and say, look, dude, it was 32% last month. I can't do that and make a profit. I need my whole formula, my business plan, my structure for this business requires that I have a labor cost of 30% or less. And so the manager goes, okay, yeah, cool. I got you. Next month, I will cut and we will run people hard, because that's what your manager is going to do to protect their own ass. And so your manager goes out and does that, and he reduces labor not just by the 2% he needed to, but he reduces it by 5%. So that's 5% decrease in cost that should come straight to your bottom line. Except it doesn't, because that negatively impacts your guest experience, let's say in this scenario, and you have a revenue drop of 10%. Well, cost is down 5%, revenue is down 10%. Guess what? That's a net loss of 5% on your contribution margin, right? That's after prime cost, you're still 5% below where you were before. So don't do that. Look at labor cost percentage, but think about everything holistically. So now let's talk a little bit about, okay, we know that we have this old model. We know that it works, generally speaking, and it is, all those rules that we've talked about before are absolutely true, but we need to put this additional nuance in here to really understand labor and manage it properly. So what are the hidden economics of investing in your staff? Where are we spending money that's going to make us more money? Well, here's just a fact. If you pay people more, they quit less. That's just a fact. You pay people more, they quit less. And so when we look across the United States, there's a huge variation in what tipped employees can, or what the tipped minimum wage is, I should say. What you can pay them as an owner. And if you're in a place like Indiana, there aren't many states like this left. We're still on federal minimum tipped wage. So it's $2.13 an hour. In some other places, it's $15, $16, $17, $20 an hour. Now, obviously, where you are is going to be a huge determinant on whether or not you can pay higher wages. But I will tell you right now, one of the things that I have always told every client I have ever talked to in Indiana, that I did at all my bars in Indiana, is if $2.13 is minimum wage, I pay $5, $6, $4, $5, $6 is kind of the range of pay that I like to do. Is that huge? No. right? That's lower than minimum wage in some states. However, it is significantly higher on a percentage basis, 75, 100% higher than what most other folks are paying. So, yeah, I'm not huge. I never have recommended or even paid people a huge amount of money, but I have always made sure that I'm significantly higher than the market rate. Now, if you're in a place where your tipped minimum wage is $20 an hour, yeah, you probably can't get higher than that because you're probably so crushed between the labor costs and inflation and everything else. Being able to pay your employees more and passing that over to your customers or taking that out of your profits just isn't going to work. But even then, if the whole premise here is that, you know what, better service, more sales, maybe you can pay a little more. So I would just encourage you, depending on where you are in the country, look at that. If you're in a state with low labor costs, low minimum wage for tipped employees, and when I say low, I pretty much mean anything under $5. Make sure you're paying at least a couple dollars more than everybody else. And if you're in a market that has very high minimum wage, well, pay the minimum wage. If you can, try to pay a little more than everybody else. Now, the big thing here is when we pay a higher wage, we have less turnover. When we have less turnover, we provide superior customer service. That guest experience is way better. And the thing is, a great server is going to have check averages that are 10 to 25% higher than a decent server. They know how to upsell more. They know how to get more out of their guests. They're better at recommending desserts. All of these things are important to the server because that's raising their tips. When their tips go up, they make more money. And I don't care if you're in a state that has a $20 minimum wage or a state that has a $2.13 minimum wage. For the vast majority of people in America that work in hospitality and are hourly employees in the front of house, the vast majority of their money comes from tips. So we are always aligned with our employees in that they sell more, we make more. We share that interest. Part of the reasons why I think tipping is not a bad thing. I know there's been a lot of controversy around that nowadays, but it ensures that everyone's aligned and that the customers are getting the best experience possible. But just keep in mind here, like I said, the more experienced servers you have, the more likely they are to be really good at that upsell. Now, better compensated staff, you know what else they do? They call out less. And I don't think anyone listening to this podcast that is in the industry would disagree with me that the number one issue in a bar or a restaurant that is small, that is your mom and pop, is employees calling out. Like, there's no question there. When your employees call out, that is the most disruptive, most difficult thing for you to deal with. Now, another thing to keep in mind, because we're talking about you take better care of your employees, they're going to sell better, they're going to be absent less, they're also probably better at their job. So they probably can do better peak period volume because they're worth it. Because you've shown them they're worth it. You've invested in them. You've spent time training them. And if you have a higher wage than most people around you, you're probably going to attract the best people easier too from around your market. So they can maintain that quality and serve more customers. So in your peak periods, you're going to have the opportunity to make more revenue. Now, the other thing they're going to do when you make people feel more valued, they're going to be more interested in protecting you. They will care more about the bar. They will care more about you as the owner. So they're going to prevent theft. They're going to prevent waste. They're going to not pass free drinks across that bar. That, for a lot of bars, that alone, if the employees were on board on, can add 3, 5, 6% to the bottom line. Now, one thing to keep in mind is sometimes you actually want to strategically overstaff, and that's during your peak periods. And the best way to do that is, especially when you have openers and closers, have that overlap where they're all there, be that peak period, be a little bit overstaffed for it, because you can always cut your opener if that business doesn't actually come in. But when you're a little bit overstaffed in your peak periods, it's going to ensure that you capture maximum revenue when your customers are willing to spend the most while providing the best guest experience. So it's a win-win. And again, if you do it with employee scheduling where they overlap each other a bit, you can just cut your opener when you need to. So let's talk a little bit now about how you implement a strategic labor investment approach. So all this stuff sounds great, right? We made the argument that just looking at labor cost percentage isn't really going to get you there. We've talked about why a more nuanced approach and taking a little bit better care of your employees is going to increase your bottom line, potentially. But let's talk about how we implement this. So the first thing I would look at is you need some other metric than just labor cost percentage. Labor cost percentage is hugely important. It's a very key financial metric to track, but let's talk about what else can we focus on. And the one that always stands out to me is sales per labor hour. Now, sales per labor hour is great. It's going to tell you how efficient you are with your labor. And it's taking it out of this abstracted place where we've separated revenue from labor cost and putting them together in a way where we're saying, oh, for each hour of labor, I get this much sales. So it's a much more level set KPI to look at. Now, if you have the ability, and very few people can do this because this would require a lot of data management, but if you can go from sales per labor hour to profit per labor hour, right? Somebody works, how much money did I make? How much money did I lose? Then you get a really detailed understanding. But profit per labor hour is a much harder metric to come up with than sales per labor hour. If you use Toast, it's spot on. I think they all have it as a standard metric inside your POS system. So that's something easy to see that you can manage and that you can work to improve over time. Now, the other thing that you should do when you're trying to implement a more strategic labor approach is to calculate the real cost of turnover in your bar. And by that, I mean, how much money did you spend on hiring last year? How much money did you spend on training? How much productivity was lost? And how much impact is there on the guest experience? Now, obviously, this is not all easy to measure just by looking at your backwards data by things that happened in the past. Some of this, you're going to have some turnover and measure it. But also, if you have a good bookkeeper and you're keeping your books arranged in a way where you have hiring and training separated out from just standard labor, that's going to help you measure those pieces. And then lost productivity and impact on guest experience, you can look at a number of different ways to kind of get an analog of that metric. But the easy one that comes to my mind first would be to just look at sales per labor hour, right? If sales per labor hour go down, you're being less productive, you're giving a worse guest experience, you're not upselling as much, you're still going to have to do your 5 whys and root cause what happened there. But sales per labor hour is going to give you a good idea of lost productivity and guest experience when you look at sales per labor hour in relation to when you've had turnover. Now, one thing that I really like to do is to implement a tiered compensation structure, right? We want to reward seniority among our team, and I'm a big fan of giving people consistent small raises. And when I say consistent small raises, I mean like a dime a quarter, right? Or maybe not a dime, maybe a nickel. It does not have to be a lot of money, right? But whether we're talking 5 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents, I'd much rather give somebody 10 cents a quarter for the first 3 quarters of the year and then 20 cents after the 4th quarter than just give them a 50-cent raise at the end of the year. Because now I'm constantly incentivizing them. So that's the first thing I will say about compensation structures, to work in these regular small increases in pay. But also, I think, quite frankly, compensation shouldn't be totally based just on seniority. So experience, knowledge, and performance should come into play here. When we've talked about training systems, and even if you go back, I don't know, it's been like a year and a half now to our conversation that I had with Greg Buda, who is phenomenal at understanding training in this industry and points out, you probably should have a 3-year program to train folks. And if you've listened before, you've heard me say that too. So there should be milestones in that training that come along with raises. So don't just give people extra compensation for seniority. Compensate people based on knowledge, experience, and performance, and seniority. The next thing I would encourage you to do is to create a strategic staffing model that ensures optimal coverage during high revenue periods, even if it increases your labor percentage there. Because those high revenue periods, normally we can squeak out a little bit more, we can upsell a little bit. It's easier to do. And like I said, that's just a matter of making sure you have shifts for your bar where folks overlap and that those overlaps happen during your peak periods so that you always have the right number of people working at the right time. Finally, more important, I think, than anything else here, measure the right metrics. And what are those metrics I would look at? Well, first of all, when we're just talking about labor cost percentage, right? May not be the best thing in the world. We've talked about a lot of ways that it probably is not what you want to use all the time, but you need to track that. Track your turnover percentage, right? How many employees do you lose and hire every year? And what is the percentage of that compared to the number of employees you have on staff at any given time, right? So if you have 10 people that work for you at any given time and 4 people quit and 4 people are hired throughout the year, well, then guess what? Your turnover rate's 40%. And if it's 40%, frankly, in this industry, you're doing pretty good. A lot of people are 75%, 80%. Some people are over 100%. So we want to measure that, and we want to get that turnover rate as low as we can. We want to look at revenue per labor hour, sales per labor hour, profit per labor hour, whichever one of those you want, but sales per labor hour is where most people are going to be because that's what's in their POS system. Look at that and try to maximize that value, because the more sales you get per labor hour, the more efficient your team is being. And that's measuring also your guest experience, because if that sales per labor hour starts to drop, something's changed in the way you're handling your guests that has caused it to drop. Along those lines, also watch average check size or guest check average. Right? Average check size is useful, but a 6 top and a 2 top are not comparable. But if you just look at revenue per guest every day or guest check average, you're going to figure out pretty soon what the average customer in your bar spends, what each body that walks in the door is worth, and you can watch whether that goes up or down. If it goes down, you have a service issue. If it goes up, you have a great service thing going on, or you raised prices. But short of raising prices, if that goes up, that's implying that you're selling more to less people, so your service must be better. If that goes down, your service is probably worse. And then finally, track your customer retention, right? What if you're using, say, Spot On as your POS? Spot On started, I don't know how many of you know this, but Spot On started actually as a loyalty program. When I had my bar, I was using them for a loyalty program way before they had a POS system. And that loyalty program is huge because it's going to keep people coming back in. But not only do they keep coming back in, you can measure it. You can watch it. And so I would encourage you to track customer retention in any way that you can. Loyalty program's a great way to do it. A lot of POS systems now can do it via credit card data and show you how much time your guests come in. Spot On has it. I know Toast has it built in too. So find a way to measure that customer retention, because that's going to tell you whether or not you're pissing your regulars off or building new regulars. So today we've challenged the conventional wisdom about labor costs in bars, exposed how obsessive focus on minimizing labor cost percentage is actually going to probably hurt your profitability. We've also explored how strategic investment in staff compensation and adequate staffing levels can dramatically increase your bottom line through reduced turnover, increased revenue per customer, and better operational control. The key thing I want you to remember here is that the most profitable bars around you, the most successful people in this industry, understand that labor isn't just a cost to be minimized. It's an investment that drives revenue and a cost that needs to be optimized. By shifting your perspective from seeing staff as an expense to viewing them as a revenue-generating investment, you can transform your business and potentially see a nice increase in your profits. So I would encourage you to take one action this week. Calculate the true cost of replacing one of your bartenders, including all the hidden costs we discussed. Figure out what that turnover actually cost you. Look at your turnover rate for the last year if you have the data to do it, and then think on that, because I have a feeling that single exercise of figuring out what your turnover is and what it costs you to replace someone, down to the penny, might completely change the way that you think about labor in your bar. That about wraps it up for today. If you enjoyed today's insights, make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a review. If you are ready to take your bar to the next level, schedule a strategy session with me by clicking the link in the show notes below. Until next time, have a great day, and we will talk again later.